last week's session definitely about theory, but because I was given the opportunity to speak again here, and because a lot of people actually quite liked the last session, we will have a more practical session today. I will show you how you could create one such design system if you have some basic elements already in place. I will also walk you through example of one such design system. We will start with that. And I will show you and explain how people are thinking about design systems, what is important about them, and you will see this in practice, right? And then at the end, if you liked what you've seen, I will also hand out the licenses to Supernova, which is a tool that we are creating for managing design systems and which we will be using today throughout the session to basically create and document a design system, right? So this is completely optional. If you just like what you see, just reach me out on Discord and I will give you a license, and then you can wow your future employee or your current colleagues with a design system of your own creation. Now, let me start by sharing my screen. This time it will be more practical. And let's start with this session. So what I wanted to start with is to walk you through one example of a design system that clearly took quite a bit long time to create, to polish, and to bring into fruition in the first place. This is what you see here on the screen is Atlassian design system. I know some people who have been working on this design system, and let me tell you the stories that they tell me basically about how much effort goes into something like this, how there are very large teams who are actually managing this from the perspective of creating the content for the design system, but also from the perspective of documentation and then maybe tooling. It's very impressive, right? And I think not many people actually understand just how much work goes into something like this until you truly deep dive into one such design system, which I think is good to spend like a first 5 minutes on, just so you know, if you want to start with a design system, then what would be your frame of reference, right? What would be the mindset that you should go into design system with? And so let's see what they actually have. Well, as you can see, this is their documentation. And for many design system teams, documentation is actually the design system itself, right? It is what people are consuming. It is where all your information about the design systems or your components or your colors, styles, and so on will live. And it is something that the people will consume. So usually, or it is quite common that teams even start with the documentation in the first place. They outline how the design system could look like inside the documentation. And then they start from that documentation to actually create that design system. Now, that, of course, doesn't happen if you are just like individual, right? Or if you are a very small team. Usually you would start in Figma. You would create some component library. As you will see, we will do exactly that. But if you are a larger team, then you will usually start brainstorm before you start a design system, because starting from like a component library, you will hit a brick wall very quickly, because you will realize that you've made many choices that actually don't scale very well, right? And so especially if you add more and more complexity into design system, like light and dark mode, if you add maybe multiple brands, if you are like an airline and you need to support the different brands, that all further complicates your creation. So it is worth at the beginning to just start thinking about design system, where you want to go with it and what it should be. And so in most design systems that are like more polished, I would say, that are not just like a UI kit or a component library, you will see that one of the first places that the designers and developers will send you to is actually the foundation of a design system, or brand definition, or voice, or vision for a design system. And the reason for this is that everyone who goes into design system should be using the design system and should be adopting the principles behind that design system, right? So you need to think about how the design system was created in the first place. And then ideally, over time, you will start thinking in terms of the design system. So let's look at the Atlassian design and how they have done this. So the first section that you see, other than the components and patterns, which is something which you use most commonly, of course, is the brand. And in here you can see like a mission and personality of the design system. Now, of course, creating a personality for your design system is actually quite problematic, right? So it will take a long time, but usually at least the mission is good to define. Like, what I would like to rely on my users, right? How should my design system be presented? Is it more like a joyful design system, or is it very formal? What kinds of principles I'm adopting? Are we starting anew? So it's like completely experimental, or is there something already in place and should we just follow? There are so many questions that you ask, but if you go to their mission, then actually you can read about this quite a lot, and we will not go through this right now. But there is everything from like a personality of a design system. You know, they say it's bold, right? So they have very bold opinions about, say, their design decisions, and it's fine for them. And you can say, well, maybe we are not at the position as Atlassian, so we just want to like follow what others are doing. That is also completely fine. Design systems are defined like this. Now, when you have the vision for a design system, which we will not be doing because the vision usually takes the most time, surprisingly, then you will move to foundations, right? And foundations are usually the basic building principles behind the design system, and then also basic building elements. So, for example, if we go to foundations, you can see that they have defined every single atomic aspect of the design system, like colors, like the way they do accessibility, the way they do layouts, maybe some icon library, illustrations, logos. This all would be something that you would create at the beginning as basically a foundation of a design system. This is why it's called foundation in the first place. But you cannot really move into components or something more sophisticated, or even using a design system before you have those basic elements in place. And one slight off topic about this, foundations is usually also something that is automated in design systems. If you go to some very sophisticated companies, you will actually know that the tooling that they are usually building for themselves is almost universally focused on the foundations, not so much so on components, on like layouts and so on, but rather on those atomic elements. So, for example, if you add a color to your design system, you don't want to distribute that color throughout your entire company, right? You want to have that color distributed automatically through some CI/CD pipeline, or maybe if you create an icon, you want to immediately distribute that icon to your developers. And this is where you would use this is where you would use tooling like Style Dictionary, if you know what that is. Basically a transformation of like elements from Figma to, say, code like CSS variables and so on. And then once you have the foundations, then you will go to content and start creating actual like building blocks that you have. In their case, content is actually a little bit different. They also have design system for writing, basically. So the way you should use your texts and so on. But many companies consider content the components. And here you would see the buttons, the switches, and so on. But in here, they have components under a specific section, and components are what makes the meat of a design system, right? So in here, we can see that they have all the components that you could be using. And if we go to that component, you actually have examples of that component. Ideally, you can play around with that component. You also can immediately get a code. And then in practice, when you are using this design system, you can see how extremely useful this can be, right? Because say you want to start working for Atlassian and you start as like a junior developer or even junior UX person, then you will just go to this documentation site, and instead of figuring out how do I do this menu and figuring out what text I should use and how it works in the first place, you can just use what they have. And in their case, it is very focused on the code examples, but there are many design systems who actually describe both the design part of the design system and the code part alongside it. So there will be use cases in Figma, how you should use it in Figma. You will find the place where that component is in the first place. There is quite a lot that that design system then gives you. So as you can see, Atlassian design system, really sophisticated, but because we only really have like 30 minutes, we will not be creating something as sophisticated, but I would still like to walk you through a process of creating one such design system. And we will use Supernova for this. Now I'm a CEO of Supernova. I'm also founder, and my background is mostly engineering. I have been an engineer for most of my life. Have been working on both mobile and web projects for some really, really large companies. And as you will see, Supernova is basically an answer to creating design systems on scale, because it is really complicated to do a design system when you don't have a proper tooling. And the complexity especially shows when you are creating a documentation and when you are trying to document the designs and when you are trying to automate the design system. Because documentation is generally really complicated, especially if you want to maintain it. Because, for example, imagine that a developer creates this component and then you import that component and you render it here, right? So far, so good. But what happens if the developers actually change that component, if they change the code for that component? Well, then what has to happen is that the developer will come and will change the documentation manually. Or if you change a color inside Figma and you put that color into the documentation, it has to change again, and you will do that manually, right? And if you have so many pages as they do, and that's just one section, right? But then they have foundations and so on, that actually presents quite a lot of complications, quite a lot of work that you have to do on day-to-day basis. And so the reason why we have started Supernova is to automate all of this, and we will use it to create one design system. Now, I will switch to Figma, which is probably something that you are very familiar with. And this is one file that I will share with you after this talk, which is basically a representation of a very small design system. And I'm saying this because it's not a real representation, but it shows you some basic principles behind the design systems and how you could potentially build it. So in here, I have some colors. I have some typographies that I have defined, some icon library, some components, and also some illustrations that I would like to use inside my design system. Now, let's talk a little bit deeper about all of those sections. So starting from the atomic components, I said that you need a foundation for your design system, right? In practice, your foundation will probably be at the beginning just this, right? It will be your color palette, and maybe your color palette will be less sophisticated. In this example design system, we have quite a lot of colors that we could be using, and those colors form palettes. Usually in design systems, you have base palettes in different shades. So in here, you can see light to dark gray, but also different colors. But then you also usually have a duplicates of those tokens. We call them design tokens, basically basic building blocks or styling blocks of your design system. And a design token can be one color. So like a red 1000 could be one design token, right? But it can also be something else. For example, your animation timing can be a design token. Your shadow or the shadow style can be a design token. And all of this is in Figma specifically represented by styles. Now, Figma is a bit limited in the design tokens. It can only do some text styles and some color styles and maybe effects. But in more sophisticated design systems, you will have some different categories as well. But for the very basic example that we have here, colors will suffice. As you can see, also from the palettes, I have a semantic semantic library of colors. Usually the way you do this is you actually create your color palette, which basically defines your entire scope of colors that you can use. But then for some basic purposes, you will also create duplicates and name them appropriately to their purpose, right? So for example, in here, you can see that I have some primary colors, and primary colors would usually mean that it's like a color that you use in most of your application. It would be your like flagship brand color, right? And so in here, I have a normal primary color, which would be maybe like the basic color that my brand has, and then background color. And as you can see, I am not naming this a white and purple, but rather I'm using it primary. And the reason behind this is that if you then change the primary color to not be white, but rather something else, you actually don't have to change all the tokens inside your application, right? Because only the value will change, but you are still using the primary color. So if your boss says, now you'll do a rebrand, you actually don't have to change anything about your design. Rather, you will change the value of this token, and then everywhere where you have used it, it will actually recolor the application. And this is basic principle behind everything that you do inside the design system. You are creating design system so you can be modifying it, and so you can be distributing the design system with this like interchangeability in mind. So if you change it in the future, it actually doesn't break and doesn't require rewriting your code base. And in here, you can see that I have many more semantic tokens, right? So for example, colors for text, colors for my error states, and so on. And they are all pulling from the base palette. So we have this color library. I also have some typographies. Typographies are very easy, but in here you can see that there is like a large, medium, small, something for buttons and so on. And again, this is something that we call design tokens, and design tokens you would be using inside your code bases or even inside Figma to actually style your application. So you can then further refine the application by just changing those styles. Next up, I have icon library. There is not much to talk about. You will, inside your design system, have to have a design library of assets like this. And whether this is asset font or those are icons or those are illustration, it doesn't matter, but it will be part of your design system. Now, finally, also my design system has some components. As you can see, they are actually branded using those styles, right? So my primary colors, white and purple, are used inside my my components as well. I have that branded, and I have some variants for those buttons, for those components as well. And then finally, I've put some illustration here so we can put it into the documentation, and we can create a documentation for one specific component. So how do we start with this? Well, we have clearly already created a design system library. This is usually the most amount of work, of course, a lot of tweaking. But if you get to this point, you have a very sufficient design system library that you can now start distributing to people. And you would like to do that ideally with some documentation that we have seen at the beginning, maybe not so sophisticated, but at least to have it like deployed somewhere so you can just send it to people and they know what's up with your descriptions and so on. So within the next 20 minutes, we will do exactly that. And we will start by importing this file into Supernova. Now, I'll copy the link to the design system. As I said, I will share the link with you afterwards, and then we'll switch to a Supernova. In here, Supernova is basically a tool that allows to import data from Figma and many other sources. And it allows you to have all the data about your design system at one place. It also allows you to create the design system. You don't actually have to use Figma, especially for the basic tasks. So for example, if I would like to create a border, you can see that I have many borders created here, but that's because it's a great example of how you could create one such design token, then you can be then using to style your applications and your websites and so on. So let's call this IterateUX, and then maybe we will pick some color let's say the green one, from our palette of the tokens that we have imported from Figma, right? So maybe it will be green for 100, and I will also say, maybe I want this to have a tiny border. So now I've created a one design token that I can then deploy to my developers as like a CSS code, or maybe iOS definition if you are into iOS. I'll create one, and now you can see that my library definition inside my design system contains a new code or contains a new design system token that I can be using, for example, inside the documentation, as you will see. Now, what Supernova does, and I just have to explain you a little bit, is three things. The first one, the management of a design system. I will show you how exactly you manage this and explain you how you can use it in your next project. And then we have a documentation editor, which we will use to create the documentation. And then finally, we have automation layer, which allows you to say, for example, I have a new icon inside Figma, and if I detect that there is a new icon, I want to distribute that icon to my developer automatically. And I just don't want to be bothered by, clicking that export button and sending it to my developer, but rather automate all of this. And we can explore together if there will be some time. But just very quickly, in here in the management layer, you can see that I have tokens, I have components, and I have assets, the same thing as I have in Figma, right? So what you would do, you would create a link to the Figma file. In here, I have copied the link, so you will just link the file, and it will import all the data that we have from the tokens to components to the assets. And so you can be using them inside the documentation. And because this talk of mine is specifically focused on the documentation, we don't have to spend too much time explaining what all of those elements are. As I said, you will all get licenses. You can play around with your design system, but we will go straight to the documentation. And I'll explain you how you would maybe start approaching your documentation. So in here, I've created a few documentation pages that I think should form a base for all of your design systems, right? The first page that I have created is basically a representation of my thinking about the design system, basically the vision. And if you would be starting with a vision for your design system, how would you approach that? It's actually quite challenging, but I think there is a very reasonable cheat how to do that. And that cheat is, don't think about the design system as a design system, but actually think about it as a product, right? So if you would be creating a new mobile application, then this would be your product. And mobile application actually shares so many things with the design system, because design system is a product after all. You will have processes, you will have documentation, you will have some things that you are contributing actively to it. And so if you think about the design system as a product, then creating a vision for it is actually much easier, right? So some people, if they struggle with this, they actually substitute a design system with some product of their own that they thought that they can create as like a side project, right? And then when you are thinking about that side project, you can actually apply all the same rules and create the vision for that side project, but you will ultimately see that the vision for the design system will actually make so much sense as well. Of course, if you go into the in-depth design systems as the Atlassian, there are quite a lot of more processes that go into it. But if you are just starting, then this is a quite nice cheat how to do that. So you can see then in here, I've written some of the base principles right behind a Racket, which is how I call my design system for the purposes of this demo. I've also added some nice images. I think it is important to have a little bit more fun with your design system. And so, sorry, I'm just looking at the questions here. All right, that's good. So far, so good. And so in here, I have been creating some of the basic principles already. Also with our mascot, this very nice, very scared probably cat. I think every design system should have its own mascot. So you can just do that of your own. It is important to have fun when you are creating a design system, because I will tell you, it is a daunting task. It is a lot of work, and you have to be prepared for it. But ultimately, companies are investing into it, and it is very important, I think, for everyone who is dabbling in the UX to have those skills in the first place, to understand what a design system is and how you would approach this. So let's do actually something concrete here. I just written a few texts, right? And it's not very important. You will see the documentation side at the end where I share it with you. But let's do something real. So as you have seen in the Atlassian design system, after the foundation, they have the atomic elements, the design tokens, the typographies, the icons, and so on. How would you document something like this? Well, usually you have few options. The first one, you would describe everything as text, right? That's not exactly great because we humans are very visual. And so design systems should be very visual as well. You ideally want to have as much visuals as possible and keep the text to, I would say, the bare minimum that allows you to describe what you are doing properly. And so in here, I've created a style guide. I've started to create a style guide, and I have colors, I have typography, and I have the icons as like three main areas that I would like to focus on. Now, the first thing that I want to do in here, in the texts after the general guidelines, is to actually show to the users that we actually have some colors, and those colors are the ones that we should be using. So what I will do, I will write /token. If you have ever used Notion or Coda or tools like this, then the editor that you will play around with will actually feel exactly like that, because we've been very inspired by how those tools do this. And so if you write /anything or /my wish, basically, like a /token, you will get an appropriate block that allows you to put certain elements from a design system into your documentation. And what I would like to do is to highlight some of the main colors. Usually in the style guide, the first thing that you will highlight is your primary colors, like what is my accent of the brand, right? And so in here, I will use the token list, say I want to highlight some colors, and now I have a palette of colors. And as I said, not only I have palettes, but also I have the semantic colors, maybe the primary foreground and background color. So I can actually search for the primary one. And in here, I will use, say, the background color and also maybe the actual primary color that you would be using on your elements. And now I have inside my documentation already two colors that I think will form a base for my design system, right? And the very nice thing about Supernova, and something that you will have to think about when you are creating design systems, is also theming. Now, in most cases nowadays, applications are either in the process of creating a dark mode or already do support dark mode. So usually the light and dark mode has to be supported in design system. The big problem with design systems is that if you create a light mode and dark mode, and you've probably encountered this in Figma as well, is you actually have to create a duplicate of the element, right? So if you would be designing light and dark mode for your app, you would probably have two different views separately next to each other. One would be light and one would be dark. But with design systems, this is very problematic because you don't really want to have primary color twice. You just want to have primary color once, but then with a different view, depending on how you are looking on your design system. And this is actually possible in Supernova. We will not go into detail, but I will just show you. I've set it up already before this talk, and so I can switch between my design system definitions. I have few of them defined, and in here you can see that I have like a default theme for my design system, but I can also switch to the alternate one. And as you can see, the colors of the design system change, right? And you don't only have to do colors, but also say assets or components, because they also need to be themable. And so we have support for this, but it actually helps you quite a bit to handle the design system variants for yourself. Now, let's say that we don't want to just selectively add the colors. Because one annoying thing about design systems is that if you don't maintain them properly, they really go out of date very quickly. Because like imagine that we would write this documentation today, right? And then after the talk, you will forget about your design system documentation, you will be distributing it, but your designers in the meantime will actually change those colors, right? So what will happen? Well, what will happen is that now you are designing with colors that are in Figma, and those are the actual colors that you should be using, but you are actually distributing documentation with colors that are not exactly what you are creating in the first place, right? And this is a big problem because right now we only have 4 pages and already I have elements that we would have to change manually. If we have like 500 pages, which is not unheard of, then you are not doing anything else and then basically just changing those elements. So for this reason, we also have some other tools at your disposal. For example, let's say that we use a token group here. And again, I will use colors. But now I want to just show all the tokens. And so I will, for example, select a palette. And now you can see that I've put the entire palette definition into my docs, right? And the nice thing about this is if you have noticed this Figma icon here is that it's actually connected to Figma. So if you change it in Figma, it changes inside the documentation as well. And this will be very easy to maintain because if you add anything from Figma, if you change anything from Figma, it automatically updates. And if you ever go into a company that tells you we are doing design systems manually, I would strongly recommend that you recommend them that they actually create a lot of automation because you don't want to work in that company in the first place, because the only thing that you will be doing is actually changing your design system documentation, right? We have seen that hundreds of times. We have a lot of customers that are struggling with something like this. And I'm just stating it at the beginning. It is very easy to start with a proper chain that actually, or with proper tooling that actually updates most of the things for you. But it is really hard to add that tooling over time when you actually already have a documentation and it's fully manual, right? So next time you are starting to do a design system, or if you encounter it, always make sure that you are doing as much as possible to automate the work that you are doing. And that this goes not only for the design systems. I think in Figma, this is another thing. You have a lot of plugins at your disposal. Try to explore them. It helps a great deal. And a lot of smart people created a lot of automations for this, right? So I've put a palette here, and as you can see, we have documented the tokens. Now, the very nice thing about Supernova is that we can now hit publish, and it basically creates a documentation site for you, because this is just editor. Similarly, how you have Notion and you can edit the pages, you have the editor there, but in here, you basically have editor and also a way how you can show and deploy that and distribute this to your viewers, to your consumers that will be using that design system. So if we go to that design system, now you can see that it created a site that you can just copy paste the link to, and you can send it to someone, and I will share it at the end. And if we go to the style guide and to our default brand colors, you can see that we have added the 2 main colors, but we also have the palette here, right? And now if you actually want like a hex color or RGB definition of that token, you can go to this and you will always know what this definition is. So in here, it's also tracked from Figma. You change it from Figma, it changes here as well. So now we basically have documented colors. It's great. Didn't took too long, right? So we can continue and speed up this process. I have done this thousands of times, so I can show you how fast it is when you truly know what you are doing. So let's document the typography, for example. Again, I will write /token, create a token group that allows me to document typography this time. And in here, I will just say, show me all typography tokens. And now, as you can see, it added me all the typographies. It also tells me that, for example, I didn't upload the font file for this font. So I have to fix this in order to render this properly. And again, you can see that I have a theming in place, so I can switch to the alternate view, which actually uses different font for say my different brand, or your variants will vary, of course. And we can do the same with the last thing, which would be the icons. So let's say we want to tap into asset library. In here we have asset library block, and it basically allows you to tap into any asset that you have added from Figma. I want to show all the icons, so it will render me all the icons. Maybe we will make it a little bit smaller so it looks nice. And now we can again republish the documentation, and you will see that in addition to having this environment where you can change it, it will also actually render the icons very nicely on the front end. So just refresh the documentation, going to icons. You can see it now. I have all the icons inside my design system. You can download them if you want to. If we go to the typography, it renders the typography. You have the definition of how your H1 should look like and so on. And keep in mind that this is all immediately connected to Figma. So any change that you do there will be propagated to the docs. This is really important because it allows you to not worry about maintaining the design system, but rather actually contributing new stuff to it, right? And finally, let's do something even more sophisticated. As you have seen, after you have the atomic elements, you can create the more sophisticated ones like components, right? So this is both for designers, and if we also have developers on a call, you will really like this. I am a developer and I really like this. So in here, you can document both the design and the code aspect of the components, right? And this is one of the most difficult things inside the design system in general, because in components, this is where you will basically have to align with your code base, right? So usually you start with Figma and you would design this, and then the developer would come and they would create basically a code counterpart of your component. But you cannot document just the design part, because actually the code part is really important, right? Half of your team will be using that code part. And you also cannot omit the design part, because if you only create a code representation of that component, then designers will probably use those components incorrectly inside Figma in the first place. And so usually what I recommend is that you create 2 tabs, or depending on how you want to structure your documentation, that can be different. But I like to structure it in like design and code parts. And the design part is specifically focused on the designers and shows you, bits and pieces about the component, right? So in here, I've, for example, created an illustration inside Figma that represents a button and shows me the anatomy of a button. So like what is possible and what is the configuration of that button. And I've also put a variants which are coming from Figma. Now, the very nice thing about Supernova, and one thing that I really like, is that you can actually request any frame from Figma. So if you have linked a Figma file, you can select any frame that is there inside Figma to be rendered inside the documentation. And so, for example, this is one frame, but if I would change this frame inside Figma, this illustration changes in Supernova as well. It's very handy because the visual content, you will have a lot of it. And it's very nice to have one place where you can just, play around with it. But then again, you don't have to worry about going into some tool, be Notion or Supernova, and just like changing every single image. Because one of the issues that you will encounter is that once the documentation grow, you will actually lose track of where everything is used, right? So like if you have image here and it is like 500 pages, how do you know that that image is here in the first place? Again, automation really important. Cannot stress that enough. And in here, I basically documented component using the following structure. I wrote a description, a small piece of description of the component, like what it is, how it should be used. Then I put a basic anatomy about the component. So basically what it consists of. And if you have sophisticated variants, also maybe showing what are the different bits and pieces and what components to participate in those. And then I've also rendered all the variants that are coming from Figma, because you want to see what the designers see inside Figma even inside the documentation, right? The variants are very important because they actually tell you like what is the scope of that button, how much can I change this, and so it is very important to highlight all the variations of this button. And then I've put an interactive component from Figma in here. So again, everything is just hidden behind Figma. You write Figma and it allows you to either embed a specific file or specific component or a render from it. And now, as for the code part, I hope that we have at least a few developers here on the call. But just very quickly, we have few options, and in general, you will want to have few options how you can document your components. The first one, of course, you will always put some static code that represents that component. Right? If we go to the example of the Atlassian design system, you can see that there are always examples. So just so you can take this, copy paste it into your environment, and it will render exactly this component. And the more examples you can make for the users, the better, because they will ultimately spend less time basically creating a guessing game, right, about how they should be configuring this in the first place. Very good example when you will be looking at something is Material UI. Material UI has, I would say, extreme amount of examples for each of the buttons or each of the switches and so on. If you want to see how exactly should be components documented, this is basically the best as it gets. But of course, a lot of work. The other, there are some other tools that allow you to document and visualize components as well. In your design system work, you will probably come across Storybook, which is basically a library that allows you to render React components, and it allows you to render web components and so on. And you can embed this into Supernova as well. But one last thing that really I do really like myself is that we actually also have a compiler on the front end of the Supernova. And so you can write a live code here. And if I would, for example, change the live code inside the Supernova, it actually changes the components. We can, for example, change the text of it. We can change the definitions. We can change the different aspects of the imported components. And so using different combinations of those components that we have available, you can actually achieve quite a great results, very close to even those very sophisticated tooling like, say, the Atlassian design system is. One last thing, you will probably get into a point in your design system journey where if your design system really grows, your documentation will not be at one place. Now, this is very common, especially if you start a design system or official design system from two disconnected parts. You already have Figma and you already have a code base. In that code base, you will probably have a documentation about how the components should look like, right? Or how they should be used and so on. And what you probably don't want to do is to bring the documentation that you have already created in that code base into a tool like Supernova or Notion or something else, because then you are basically killing the work of the developers that they have created. Rather, you want to reuse this. So it's completely possible to think about this scenario, and we actually do have support for this as well, where you can just link a markdown file or your documentation and it becomes natural part of your docs as well. And so if we have published this, then our documentation site will look like the initial principles that we have created, the style guide in here with the colors, with the typographies, and with the icons, which are rendered here and will grow as you are adding more and more icons. And then we have one component documented, and this component has the interactive components from Figma. It has the variants rendered, and they also tell you whether the variant has like a icon hidden and what state it is and so on. And it has also the component structure, basically the anatomy of the component that we have created in Figma in the first place. And for the developers, you can see that I can switch to the code representation of the component. I have some interactive component here. I can tap on the components and so on. But I also have the interactive showcase with the code. And one nice thing about what you will have at the end is that your developers can also click this magical button, edit code live, and then you can also be changing the code inside the documentation, play around with this. And as you can see, like I was able to create this documentation. Granted, I was cheating a little bit because I've created this content in the first place before we have started. But very quickly, I'm able to add components, I'm able to add tokens and so on. And if I just stick to basically the basic outline of the documentation that I have created, I can be also extending it very nicely. So this is how you would do a documentation. Creating a docs is very difficult task. It will take a lot of time to master that, but I would assume that you are all very smart people, so it's actually not a problem. But I would always recommend, if you can, look at the tools that are out there, either Supernova or anything else, and let them help you, because creating design systems is very large and very sophisticated work as it is, and you really want to have as much help as possible. But this is not all that I wanted to show you. I know that we only have like say 5 minutes, so I want to show you one last thing, and that is where Supernova is actually useful even for you when you don't have a design system. When you are using Supernova for your regular projects, if you are, say, doing freelancing and so on, you usually want to deliver as much information to your developers as possible without actually explaining them what it is in the first place, right? And so we have automation layer where you can basically import the Figma files and then say, I want, for example, an Android representation of my Figma files, not just say the colors, but also typographies, maybe icons and so on. And as you know, even like exporting entire icon library actually takes a lot of time. You have to do it for different like X2, X3, PNG, SVG. It's just a lot of work that you do manually. With Supernova, you can actually automate this, and I will automate it for you. I've already created a automation before this call, and in here I've set up multiple automations, in fact. So from my design system, I am delivering to Android codebase, to a CSS definitions. I also am creating assets of different kind, like PNGs and SVGs, and it all works in unison. And we have this very nice technology that we call hooks that basically observes whether something is happening in your Figma files or in your design system in the first place. If something happens, then we can push to your code base automatically. And if you want to see how it looks like, then I will trigger one of the automations, which will basically create a request to represent a design system, in this case as an Android view, as an Android representation. And I've shown you that I have many tokens here, quite a lot. In fact, if you would do this by hand, you would probably be doing it until like tomorrow or Saturday. But I've triggered the automation that will basically deliver that code on my behalf. So if we go to the builds, you can see that already the automation has triggered, and I can view the pull request, which actually contains all of the colors, all of the fonts that I have defined automatically. And you can just copy paste this into your Android code base, or commit when you are a developer, and you don't have to spend too much time on it. So in those 50 minutes that we had together, we basically went from not having a design system to having a documentation, sort of. It requires a lot of work, of course, and also automating the delivery. And I wanted to have this session just to show you that actually the tools for design systems nowadays are getting more and more powerful, and there is not just Supernova, there is quite a lot of more of them. And if you want to start with design systems, they also provide you with a very nice guidance how to do that, because they put you into those small limitations that you always have to adhere to when you are creating a design system. This is what I wanted to show you today. As I said at the beginning, I'm also very happy to provide you with licenses for Supernova should you want to use it for your own benefit, should you just want to learn and experiment with the design system. And if you use Supernova on something really cool, it would also be very nice to just see what you have done and maybe even promote it on your behalf. Of course, the licenses will be for free, so you can just play with it, and it will be up to you what you do with it.
Hey everyone, on behalf of IterateUX, we would like to thank you so much for watching this week's event. If you like the content, please leave a like and subscribe. We'll have events every Thursday at 5:30 Pacific Time. Join our Discord in the description to find out more.